Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the ICNC academic webinar with Juan Masula Jimenez, doctoral researcher at the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the European University Institute. My name is David Reinbold, and I am the coordinator of digital initiatives at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. Today's presentation will be a compelling story of a community of ordinary campesinos who have led a long-standing, sustained, and organized effort to non-violently resist armed opponents in Colombia's long-standing civil war. Today's webinar will be about an hour in length, and it will be in two separate portions. The first portion is a presentation that will last about 30 minutes or so with Juan, and the final portion will be a Q&A session in which you can ask your questions. During the presentation, if you'd like to minimize your control panel, you can do so by clicking the little red arrow at the top of your screen that points inward. Don't worry about background noise during the webinar, as all participants are currently muted except for Juan and myself, so this won't interfere with the audio. During the Q&A portion at the end, there are two ways to ask questions. One way is we would ask you to have your microphone or a telephone ready, and if you click the raised hand button, it's the small yellow button you'll see on the side panel. That will alert us that you have a question, and we can unmute you so you can ask your question. The other way is to ask your question by typing it into the questions panel at the right side of the screen. I will then read all questions at the end, and Juan will answer. But please do hold your questions until we start the Q&A portion, and we will try to get to as many of you as we can. If we can't get to your question during the webinar, we will send them to Juan and ask him to reply to those in a written format, and we will post those to the webpage along with the webinar recording. And with that, I will hand controls over to Juan and provide a brief introduction to him. Juan Masula Jimenez is a doctoral researcher at the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the European University Institute. He is also an honorary member of the Consortium on Social Movement Studies and an associate researcher at the Conflict Analysis Resource Center. He studied political science and sociology at Javeriana University in Bogota, Colombia, and holds a master's degree in international peace and security from the Institut Barcelona de Estudis Internacionals, and another master's degree in comparative politics from the Central European University. Juan is also a recipient of the 2014 ICNC Research Monograph Award. And I will now hand the controls over to Juan, and he will begin his presentation.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be part of the webinar sessions. Before getting started, I would like to thank the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict for giving me this opportunity to share my work with you and for all the support throughout the process of drafting the monograph that I'll be presenting today. So today I will be speaking about a particular way or form of civil resistance that takes place in the context of civil war. The title of my presentation is The Power of Staying Put, Nonviolent Resistance Against Armed Groups in Colombia. This is the same title of the monograph that I drafted with the support of the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict that is available for free download on their website. I'll be presenting on this type of nonviolent resistance through the experience of one concrete case in Colombia, which is that of the peace community of San José de Apartado. The data and the information on which this presentation and the monographs are based was collected in several trips to Colombia in field research that I have conducted during the last 3 years. The peace community of San José de Apartado is located in northwestern Colombia in a region called Urabá in the department of Antioquia. On the 23rd of March 1997, a group of about 1,500 peasants took a stand against violence. While most of the people were fleeing the village because of a spike in violence following the arrival of right-wing paramilitary armies, a group of farmers decided to stay put and organize themselves into a peace community, the peace community of San José de Apartado. Fully unarmed and with the use of exclusively nonviolent methods, they said no to war and refused to collaborate in any possible way with all the different armed groups that were present in their territory. They set up a local institution and established new rules of behavior to stay away from a war they did not feel it was theirs. In spite of harsh repression by multiple armed groups, including the armed forces of the state, in March 2015, they were celebrating their 18th anniversary. There are many things that are puzzling about the peace community of San Jose Apartado, and therefore there are many interesting questions that one could ask in order to understand better this particular type of civil resistance. In particular, I focus on one set of questions that deal with the emergence of this type of civil resistance. In the monograph, I try to give an answer to four main questions. The first one is, what were San Jose peasants aiming for with nonviolent resistance? The second one is about the conditions that pushed them towards this choice. The third one is what made coordinated and collective action possible. The last one is which were the main methods they used in order to advance nonviolent resistance. Although this last question is not directly related to the emergence of the community, it's of special interest for the work that the ICNC has advanced. So before going into detail in each of the questions, I would like to highlight what I do think is the central message, not only of this presentation, but also of the experience of the peace community of San Jose Apartado. It can be summarized in two words: civilian agency. What do I mean? By this, I want to highlight the fact that civilians, when they live in the middle of a civil war, they have several options. They have several choices. They are not bounded. They are not only victims, and they are not bounded to collaborating with armed groups or leaving the area. When they decide to stay in their village, they have multiple courses of actions to follow. This simple graph shows the different alternatives that they have. In my work, I focus on one particular response, which is resistance, and one that is of the non-violent form. To my best knowledge, I think that this type of response is not very well understood, is under-theorized and under-conceptualized, and the aim of my work is to move towards a better understanding of this type of response. So basically, the message is that civilians do not have to choose between collaborating with armed groups or displacing from their villages. They can actually resist, and furthermore, they can do this by using non-violent methods. Let's go then to the first questions. What were villagers aiming for? I argue that first and foremost, civilians, villagers in San Jose were aiming for protection from violence. This is not to say that they didn't have any other objectives and that the peace community is only about protecting civilians from violence. I just want to highlight that at the core of the decision to organize themselves into a peace community, there was an urgent need of protecting themselves from violence, especially in a context in which violence against civilians was increasing substantially. This central aim is clearly reflected in their main principles and the rules of behavior that govern the peace community. In 1997, when they gave birth to the peace community, about 1,300 peasants signed a declaration. They made a public event in which they came together to sign this declaration with the presence of different actors, including international actors coming from European embassies, different NGOs, international organizations, in which they said no to armed groups, and they stated their goals and the norms that were going to rule their behavior since that moment onwards. So from in this declaration, one can identify four main principles that are connected to this need and this aim of guaranteeing a minimum level of protection. The first one is that they commit not to participate directly or indirectly in the hostilities. The second one is that they commit not to carry arms and not to own arms. The third one, they commit not to provide any type of information to armed groups present in the territory. The last one, they commit not to turn to armed groups to manage or resolve disputes. The connection between the first two and protection is quite straightforward. The less involved you are into the dynamics of war, the less contact you have with arms, ammunition, explosives, the less exposed you are to violence. The connection between the last two and the aim of protection is a little bit more tricky, but very important. From research in civil war and in violence in civil war, we have learned that information is one of the main resources that armed groups seek in order to exercise violence. When civilians decide not to provide any more information, they are preventing armed groups from gathering this resource, and therefore they in a way make the exercise of violence more complicated, more difficult. And then the fourth one, which is not turning to them in order to resolve disputes, is a way to close the doors into the community for armed groups. Many times in civil war, armed groups are the ones that solve problems at the community or even at the family level. These people decided to create their own institutions to solve their own problems. This clearly reduced the frequency and the amount of interactions civilians had with armed groups, and in this way they were protecting themselves from the intervention of armed groups into civilian affairs. In this slide, what you are seeing is a banner that you will find everywhere in San Jose, in those areas in which the peace community is settled. The peace community has one main hamlet where most of the members live, but they are all spread. They have members all spread in different hamlets, so they have a need to demarcate the territory. So in this banner, which contains the principles that I just presented, plus other commitments that they have, they demarcate the territory of the peace community, and at the same time they signal armed groups their intentions and their commitments. And this is also a clear manifestation of their aim of protecting themselves from violence through signaling neutrality in a clear and concise way. Let's move now to the second question. What conditions triggered resistance? In my work in San Jose de Apartado and also in other communities that resist armed groups in the civil war, in the Colombian civil war, I have identified three main conditions that triggered resistance, that push civilians towards this choice. The first one is the presence of more than one armed group, and the presence of multiple armed groups that are fighting each other in order to control the territory. The second one is an increase in the levels of violence against civilians. The third one is a perception among those civilians that the violence that is taking place in their village or in their area is inescapable, that there's very little, if anything, they can do in order to avoid violence or to minimize the chances of becoming a victim. This is exactly what happened in San Jose de Apartado in 1996 and 1997, when the peace community emerged. After many years of left-wing guerrilla control, mainly initially FARC and the EPL, and afterwards only FARC, by the beginning of the 90s, right-wing paramilitary armies started to arrive into the region of Urabá in order to dispute the territorial control FARC long had there. FARC FARC confronted paramilitary armies in order not to lose control, and generated a situation in which civilians were unable to read who was the strongest player in town. This situation of territorial dispute, as other theories in the field have pointed out, creates a situation in which violence against civilians is more likely to happen. And then it comes the topic of perception. So as for the first condition in this slide, we can see how in after 1993, violent activity of armed groups increased in Apartado. In this graph, I show this is data from CERAC, the research center for which I work in Colombia, that it measures the number of violent events per each group in a particular area, in this case, the municipality of Apartado. As we can see, after 1993, there's a clear increase in violent events by mainly the paramilitary armies, but also by FARC, which is the yellow line, paramilitaries are the blue line, and also the state forces, the army and the police, which is the green one. And then if we see which is the peak of violent activity in this series, we see that it's exactly in the period in which the peace community was created. So this figure gives us a sense of how active were different armed groups in the area. It's not a story of only one group, but multiple actors in town exercising violence. Moving to condition 2, anti-civilian violence, in this figure, we see that also in the beginning of the 90s, and especially in 1996, 1997, there's a huge increase of civilian deaths in Apartado. And although the main perpetrator is in this period is the paramilitary armies in blue, we also see that FARC victimized a lot of civilians, especially in the period right before 1997, 1996, 1997. Whereas before 1993, when they had an almost hegemonic control of the area, they never killed civilians, or the levels were extremely low. So this gives us a sense of how things were changing at the moment in the village of San Jose de Apartado. And it tells us that it was not only one group victimizing civilians, but that with the arrival of the paramilitaries in the area, the group that used to control the area also started to victimize civilians. As for condition 3, it's hard to gather quantitative data to show perceptions of civilians, to show how civilians perceived violence, that the violence that was affecting them. Unless we carry out surveys, it's really hard to come out with quantitative data. But in my work, I have collected several testimonies of villagers from San Jose, and one of the main topics of my interviews, which are semi-structured, deal with the perception of violence. Here in this slide, I have only 3 testimonies that illustrate well the way they were perceiving the violence that was affecting them. So let me read these 3 quotes. The first interviewee says, they, armed groups, were shooting everywhere, even at civilians who were just working the land. Anyone was a target. Another of my interviewees, referring to the paramilitaries, says, they were not killing because you were part of the UP. The UP is a left-wing political party that had some particular links with FARC, or because you were collaborating with someone. They were killing whoever they felt like killing, kids included. The third quote, the third interviewee, he says, it was not that they were identifying concrete people. As we lived in the rural area, they, the paramilitaries, took us as supporters of the guerrillas. They have always stigmatized peasants. But here it was worse because guerrilla groups moved freely in this area for many years. From these three quotes, we connect these three quotes to the concepts that we used in civil war research. We identified two main types of targeting. The first one is indiscriminate targeting in the way of random violence. They were killing people randomly. The second one is what has been called recently collective targeting, which refers to targeting people because of the group they are a member of, in this case, because they live in a particular village. What these two types of targeting have in common is that they leave very little room for civilians to escape violence. If it's random, there's little you can do or not do in order to avoid violence. And if it's collective, unless you leave the area, and in this case, if it is collective in this case, which was living in a particular area, unless you leave that area, there's little of anything you can do in order to minimize the likelihood of being targeted. So this gives a sense of how civilians were perceiving this violence as something unescapable. Let's move now to the third question. We're still in the second question. What conditions trigger resistance? So altogether, these three conditions, meaning multiple armed groups disputing the territory, an increase in violence against civilians, and a perception of this violence being either indiscriminate or collective, made non-violent resistance more available as a course of action for civilians. Why this is the case? Because these three conditions introduced disorder and uncertainty into civilian life. They also broke up the existing equilibrium in civilian armed groups' interactions. They also transformed the beliefs and expectations that civilians had about armed groups' behavior. They also created an urgent need for finding alternative ways to protect themselves. And finally, they lowered the threshold for risky action. I don't have enough time to go in detail in each of these each claims, but if in the Q&A you want me to elaborate on them, I'll be happy to do it. So now let's move to the third question. How did San Jose villagers manage to organize resistance? I think this is a very important question because for us students of social movements and collective action, it's clear that having a grievance or having a motive or even a desire to do something collectively, it's not enough for us to observe actual collective action or observe a social movement. In the absence of capacity, it's really hard to translate these grievances into actual collective action. So when dealing with this question, what I try to do is to identify which elements are increasing or decreasing the levels of capacity that each community has. In the concrete case of San Jose Apartado, I have identified two general aspects that increased their capacity for collective action, and in this sense help explain why these villagers managed to work collectively upon the desire of resisting armed groups. The first one has to do with previous experiences of collective action. Although many leaders, community leaders in San Jose before the creation of the community in 1997 were killed or left the area because of violence and fear, many of the today members of the community, and actually many of them that today are leaders of the community, they were active in social movements, in social organizations, in political parties, in political organizations, also even in trade unions before the creation of the community. Although in these collectivities. They were working on completely different topics and perhaps with completely different people. These experiences gave them a know-how and a disposition for collective action. So they knew how to work in groups, how to work collectively, but also they had an idea of the potential benefits of acting collectively. They in a way knew that collective action gives more leeway in complicated situations. However, although this was a very good base for collective action, for mounting nonviolent resistance, this was not enough. Especially because, as I said, many of the historical leaders of the area were killed before or they left the area. So they were leaderless, and they had a lot of fear that was preventing them to do something new collectively. So here is when the second aspect comes in, which is what I call external sites of support that bring in mobilizing resources. This is nothing different than saying that there were other actors, third actors, in the sense that they were people that were not coming from the community itself. So they were not peasants from San Jose that came into the picture in order to support San Jose villagers in organizing nonviolent resistance. For the concrete case of San Jose Apartado, I have identified three main groups. The first one is the Catholic Church. The second one is NGOs, religious-based NGOs, both of them based in Bogota, Colombia's capital. And the third one is a group of people connected to the local government, to the local government of the municipality of San Jose Apartado, in particular one woman who was then, in 1997, the mayor of San Jose, of Apartado, sorry. These external sites of support, these external actors, gave clear form to existing ideas. This is very important to highlight, which is, it's not that they came with the idea of building a peace community or they came with the idea of neutrality. These were things that, based on my interviews, villagers were already discussing for some months, but these people with new resources and with other experiences were able to give a clearer form, which was very important in stimulating the creation of the community. They also provided training in leadership. They carried out several workshops in which they were training people to become leaders. And they did not only train people in leadership, but they actually provided leaders. There's one particular case that is very, very important for the peace community of San Jose Apartado, and a name that will come up in every single interview that you do there, which is the name of Edward Lancheros, who was a lawyer coming from an organization called Justicia y Paz in Bogota, who not only decided to help the peace community, but decided to move to San Jose and live there. And he actually lived with them until the day he died in 2012. So they provided training in leadership, but also provided concrete leaders. And finally, they provided encouragement and validation. In my interviews, I see how villagers tell me that they had these ideas, but they were a little bit unsure if this was actually a good idea. For instance, if this made sense or not, if this had any chance of being successful or not. And when these people came and told them, yes, this is a great idea, yes, this can be done if you do A and B, they empowered peasants and push them towards actually organizing this. So these are the two elements that help explain how come unarmed peasants were able to organize in order to resist and defy fully armed groups in San Jose. Moving to the fourth and last question, which is the methods of action that villagers used in order to advance nonviolent resistance in San Jose. In the monograph that, as I said, is available for free download, I provide a very detailed list of tactics used by them based on the list of Gene Sharp that he put together back in 1973. That is a very, very long list of different actions, so I can't really go in detail into this, but if you want to read them, there's you will find them there in the monograph. But if you want to organize these different types of tactics into different groups, I have identified three main groups of nonviolent, three main types of nonviolent action. The first one is what I call disruptive actions. They are disruptive because they clearly break the normal development of things. They are quite beyond business and as usual. Perhaps the best example of a disruptive action for the case of San Jose Apartado is the public declaration. The public declaration that they made in 1997 in order to create the peace community. This was particularly disruptive, not only because they, without any or much consultation with armed groups and with different actors, they unilaterally and publicly declared themselves neutral. They told armed groups from now onwards, we won't collaborate anymore with you, and we will not allow you to come into our territories if you are holding arms. So it was quite of a shock for armed groups present in the area, but also because it was perhaps the first expression of this type of non-violent resistance in Colombia. This is not to say that this was the first experience. There are others that come before, but in this confrontational way of doing things, I would say that is among the first, if not the first. The second type is contained actions. Contained actions are actions that are less contentious, less confrontational, but that are very important in terms of advancing nonviolent resistance. Clear examples are signing petitions, something the peace community of Apartado does all the time in order to claim justice, to fight against impunity, and addressing letters to high-level officials, both in Colombia and internationals. Perhaps these two actions, if we think of a normal social movement in a Western democracy, they look a little bit, they don't look contentious at all. But if we take into account the context of a civil war and the situation under which these people were and have been acting, they become clearly more contentious. There have been the signing petitions and addressing letters have been very, very important for the development of the community, especially because they have given them visibility and legitimacy, especially abroad, both in the United States and in Europe. The peace community has a very strong network of support that was not present when they emerged as a community, but that they became allies of the community throughout these years. Finally, routinized actions. What do I mean by this? Basically, actions that they carry on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, and that allow the community to persist over time. I would like to mention two concrete examples from the community. The first one is the internal council meetings. They have an internal council that debates the most pressing issues every week and that decides what type of work needs to be done in the next week, but also in the coming months. And they make choices of things that are very important for the community. For instance, accepting third actors to visit them. This includes researchers. So for instance, for me to go there and carry out research and learn more about the process, I have to go every time, even last trip that it was my 5th time there, I have to go through the internal council, I have to address a letter, and they have to accept this in order for me to visit. So this internal council, they meet every Sunday for 2 or 3 hours to discuss pressing issues. Then the other one is the community days. Every Thursday, every week, there's a community day. Community day is a day in which every single member of the community needs to interrupt their activities and work for the community. They need to work on tasks that the internal council decided beforehand, things that need to be done, And when I say every person needs to participate, it includes visitors. So when I'm doing field research there, for instance, I have to, on Thursday, I have to work in community tasks, which include very different things. I've been working in the cacao, with the cacao crops. I've been opening paths in order to move from one hamlet to another, cleaning up the area. So it includes very different things that are very important for the development, for the healthy development of the community, and everybody participates. And it's a very special day because it's the day in which all the community gets together, comes together, and this really, you can really feel that this reinforces the sense of a community, of what community life is and why this is very important to preserve. So this being said, just to close, I would like to to connect this briefly, the experience of San Jose de Apartado, with what is going on today in La Habana. Since November 2012, the Colombian government has been engaged in peace talks with FARC, the main left-wing guerrilla group in Colombia, and they have made very important progress to the point that it seems that by March next year, we will have a peace agreement with FARC, which is something very important. What I want to highlight here is that the experience of San Jose Apartado and that of other communities in resistance in Colombia, they deliver a very important message for those who are thinking and working on building peace at the national level. I would say that the first thing this national level talks need to take into account is that civilians are not only victims of violence and of war. They have agency and they can be agents of change. This needs to be taken into account. Connected to this is the fact that war forges strong collective identities. The peace community of San Jose de Apartado is a very, very strong collective identity with a very strong political project behind. Therefore, if the government is aiming to build a new order after the peace agreement in the area where the peace community is settled, they need to take into account which roles civilians played during war. It's not, when it comes to designing policy intervention, it's not the same to deal with a community that for 20 years or 18 years was resisting against armed groups and that organized themselves in order to basically rule every single aspect of life, from protection all the way to the education system. It's not the same to deal with this type of communities than to deal with a community that perhaps displaced several times in the course of war, or perhaps a community that lived many years under the full control of one actor. So taking into account these collective identities that come out of war, out of the experience of war, it's very important if we really want to design a framework for peace that takes into account the variation that we find in the country. And finally, it's important, it gives an important message, which is, although the peace agreement, the peace talks in Colombia, in La Habana, started only 3 years ago, this does not mean that that peace is something new for the country, right? These communities are living one message, which is at the local level, and for many years, there's people that have been working towards building a more peaceful environment, or at least building a way of living outside the dynamics of war together. So just to close, I would say that these aspects that I do believe are central to be taken into account in a national peace agreement, rather than obstacles for building peace in Colombia, they should be seen and treated seriously as potential opportunities. This is what I had to say. I'm happy to go deeper into many of the things that I presented during the Q&A, and thanks a lot for your attention.
All right, thank you so much, Juan. I'm going to go back and to show people some of the instructions. for posting their questions. So if you remember, there is a raise hand button right here. It's the little yellow hand. If you push that button, that will alert me that you would like to ask a question, and I can unmute your microphone. That way you can ask. But to get started, we do have some questions that people have typed in during the presentation. So I will go ahead and start with the first question, Juan, if you're ready.
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. Somebody asks, did you also analyze the difference between urban and rural areas of Apartado in A, armed actor control at various periods, and B, civilian deaths? I think this would further the analysis because the paramilitarios took control of the urban areas in mid-90s, but FARC continued to dominate the rural area where the peace community lived, though the rural area was still contested.
Sure, that's a very good question. I have done some research as well in the urban area of Apartado. I think it is so. If we think of the rural areas and in concrete about the village of San Jose de Apartado, we realized that the crucial moment was 1995, 1996, which is when they arrived into the town. They arrived into the village, but before then, by the beginning of the 90s, they were already in the area and they had strong control in some neighborhoods of the city of Apartado. So it's true that we need to take into account this difference in order to understand the timing of the emergence of the peace community. So the reality, they were living in the urban areas in 1992 was quite different to compare to the one they were living in 1997. So this variation is very important, and I have to say that the data that I presented is for the municipality of Apartado as a whole. So we have to read this data with caution because it suffers a problem of over-aggregation in the sense that it is lumping together what was going on both in the rural and the urban area, and the dynamics were different. So you're right, this is very important to take into account, and I've done some research on this, but it is not really reflected in the monograph because of the focus of it. But on my PhD research, I do deal with this variation. So if you're interested, we could discuss this later on as well.
Okay, great, thanks. Somebody else asks, what are the San Jose villagers like in person, and how is their morale in the midst of the repression they face? How do they stay hopeful?
So how they are in person today, which I mean, I can only say about them today as I met them in 2011 for the first time. Well, they are very friendly. They really, so it's very hard, it's hard, not very hard, but it's hard to get access, but once you get access and you start getting to know them, you really feel at home. They're very busy. They are a group of peasants that work every day since very early in the morning, so it's not that when you go there, you are the center of attention, not at all. They do their stuff, then you do your stuff, and if you actually want to get along with them or get to know them better, you have to work with them. So being there is a great experience because they teach you a lot. You really, or at least I really realized how ignorant I was when it came to many things related to the rural areas. So they are open, they are friendly, they are hopeful, but still they are very, how to say, they distrust a lot everything that is coming from the government. They really change their beliefs about the government and the state. So this makes them quite, yeah, that they don't trust people. They don't trust many initiatives, and in a way they live their life apart, which is something understandable given the experiences they went through. In terms of the morale, I think that the external sites of support were a key. They played a key role in keeping their morale up, especially in the worst moments. Not only because at some point when they didn't even have anything to eat, they were providing some material goods in order to well, to allow them to survive, but also because they clearly tell them what you're doing, guys, is great, which is something that is seldom recognized in Colombia. So the international community has been very important in keeping this moral up and in supporting the community. Today they have a permanent presence of 2 or 3 organizations from Europe and the United States, and this helps a lot for them to feel that what they are doing, that they are moving in the right direction. And yeah, that's it. Also, the church played an important role in keeping the moral up.
All right, great, thanks. Somebody else asks, please tell us more about what this peace community can do concretely to contribute to establishing a long-lasting peace process. Do they have any type of proposals?
That's a tricky question, especially when it comes to the peace community of San Jose Apartado, because as I said, they really broke up with the state. And this goes way beyond the armed forces of the state. It includes many, if not every institution of the state. So it's tricky to say what they can contribute concretely. But I would say that they have participated. One of their members, one of the leaders, was invited to La Habana as part of one of the groups of victims that went there to discuss the situation of victims within the context of the peace agreement, and they made a proposal which was mainly related to the creation of humanitarian areas, or in which people could live away from the dynamics of violence. It's a very complex proposal that didn't really, it seems that it didn't get a lot of traction, at least that's how they feel about it. But I would say that in general terms, they provide an example of how we can deal with armed groups in a different way. So for many peace researchers, what they do is not really building peace, because it's just an idea of peace as negative peace in the sense that it's absence of violence. But I would say that the work they have advanced in order to fight impunity is an example of how to deal with the past and how to bring in justice for many victims of the conflict. So maybe there's something concrete, but it's really tricky, especially for this community that has really decided to stand apart and away from these national initiatives.
All right. Somebody else asks, did the armed groups try to lure or blackmail civilians to join them? If yes, how do you handle that?
Well, so I didn't have evidence of concrete cases of armed groups trying to infiltrate, let's say, civilians, members of the community, in order to get them to collaborate with them. But what I do know, and I have seen, is that the way they are very strong and very sharp when it comes to enforcing the rules of behavior. So how they deal with this, if they see one case of maybe one civilian collaborating with one armed group, or one civilian opening the doors into their community to members of the armed groups, they will most probably ask this person to leave the community, as it has happened. It happened even actually with one leader, not because he was collaborating with an armed group, but because he accepted the help, the financial help from the state, because of being a victim, which is something they do not allow, and this person now is not part anymore of the peace community. So they are they really enforce the rules of behavior, and I think this is the way they deal with this possibility. But it's hard to know if they have infiltrated them. And then if we take this question very seriously, we will realize that the borders between infiltrating and non-infiltrating are really complicated, especially because there's members of the community that perhaps they have relatives that are members of an armed group. So I mean, if there's an interaction because of family issues, there's a sort of intervention of armed groups into the community. So this is something very hard to deal with, but I would say that it's clear that they do not accept any sort of collaboration with armed groups, and that if they see any clear indication of someone from the community doing this, that person will be expelled from the community.
All right, great. Somebody else asks, were there other communities that undertook nonviolent resistant actions, and if not, why was it only limited to San Jose? If yes, are there any connections between communities that resist nonviolently in Colombia?
So the first answer is yes, there are other communities, and they are part of my PhD research. They do it differently, so I would say that what San Jose people do is one particular form, which is more confrontational. It's a quite confrontational way of nonviolent resistance. It was a unilateral declaration that involved little, if any, negotiation with armed groups. There are other communities that have actually reached agreements with groups in order to live outside of the dynamics of violence, which is a form of resistance in the sense that they went to armed groups in order with clear conditions. It was not that so they had a clear idea of what they wanted to do, and they exposed their ideas to armed groups in order to declare themselves neutral. So there are many other communities. There's indigenous communities that have been doing this for many, many years, and perhaps are the most confrontational examples that we have in Colombia, and they are actually quite connected in the sense that there are networks between them. For instance, in the peace community of San Jose Apartado, every 2 years they have something called the University of Resistance, which brings together different experiences of nonviolent resistance in one place to discuss and share ideas, and also to do some sort of education in terms of education and training for nonviolent resistance. So yeah, they're very well connected. Not all of them are part of these networks, but some of the most visible cases are well connected, and I would say that in a way the peace community of San Jose Apartado has played an important role in connecting and gluing together these different experiences.
Great. Somebody wants to know about more about the role of the church in the civil resistance of the community. Did the church face any backlash from the state when they decided to support the community?
The church. So for the concrete case, I've seen that the church plays an important role, and not only in San Jose Apartado, but in many of the other communities that I have studied. In the case of San Jose Apartado, I would say that the main role was taken by a bishop, the bishop of Apartado, who almost at an individual level decided to support this initiative, and he really put a lot of effort into supporting the community. And although it was not a backlash from the state, he got killed afterwards, not in Apartado. He got killed in Cali, another main city in Bogota, in Colombia, sorry. The exact reasons of why he got killed are unknown, but it was clear that he was, by supporting this type of initiatives and becoming a visible actor in terms of nonviolent resistance, he became visible, and he became the enemy for many people, including armed groups, especially the paramilitary armies. So the church played an important role for instance, in pushing people towards nonviolent methods. There's perhaps not in the peace community of San Jose Apartado, but in other cases they were debating whether, when they decided to resist, they were debating whether it was better or not to do it through violent methods or nonviolent methods. And for instance, the Adventist Church had a very important role in pushing civilians towards doing this in nonviolent ways. So yeah, they provide guidance. They also serve as physical sites for meeting. So one of the communities use the church in order to meet and discuss. There's in Colombia and in many areas in Colombia, there's this thing called the law of silence, which is the armed groups really try to people that try to make people not to talk to each other, not to discuss things. They have rules, for instance, of people not that they don't allow more than 2 or 3 people gathering together in public areas. So organizing nonviolent resistance under these conditions with very little lead time and under repression, it's really hard. So for instance, one of the communities that I have studied used the church as a place to discuss what to do. So the priest was finishing the mass, let's say 5 or 8 minutes before, in order to leave some time for peasants to discuss what to do, this type of thing. So the way the church has participated in these initiatives varies a lot from case to case, but I would say that in almost every case that I have studied, the church played an important role. Yeah.
Great. Somebody else wants to know, to what degree do the first two conditions pushing for nonviolent resistance, and their examples are arrival of new armed groups and a surge in anti-civilian violence, how does that explain other types of civilian strategies as well, such as flight? Have you controlled for the fleeing behavior of civilians?
That's a very good question. So in my work, as it's written in the monograph and what I presented, I say that I treat these 3 conditions as conditions that increase the likelihood of us observing nonviolent resistance, provided a decision to stay put. So I would say that the conditions that will push people to flee can be very similar to the ones that push people towards nonviolent resistance. In this particular case, I would say that they are exactly the same. So if I have controlled, I haven't controlled in a statistical sense, especially because the bulk of my work is based on qualitative methods, but I have taken fleeing into account. It's a very important part of my work. It's one of the topics I explore through my interviews, and I have a hypothesis about it. And I would say that for the case of San Jose de Apartado, the main reason that made those who stayed to not displace was impossibility. So basically, most of them claim we didn't have anywhere to go, we didn't have any member of our family living in another city or in another village that could host us. We didn't have the money to move from one place to another. So in many cases, the staying in the place was not necessarily a choice. I mean, they had to. So I would say that, yeah, it's a very important topic. I would like to explore it more in detail, but I would say that I work with those who stayed, and once they have stayed, I analyzed which type of responses they have to armed groups.
All right, great. So I think there's a few more questions, but we will be sending those questions to Juan at the end of the webinar today. In the meantime, if you have any other questions, you can send them to webinar@nonviolentconflict.org or directly to me at dreinbold@nonviolentconflict.org, and I will forward those to Juan, and we will include the questions and answers with the recorded webinar, which will be available on our website at www.nonviolentconflict.org. And also feel free to find us on Facebook or Twitter if you're not already following us. And there is an upcoming webinar. Next Tuesday, we will be talking with Mary King, and her webinar is Learning from Gandhi, a campaign against untouchability and human error. And with that, Juan, thank you so much for presenting today.